If you're looking to start your therapeutic microdosing journey, but don't know where to start, especially when looking for the highest quality ingredients, including nootropics, and what you'd expect from a true microdose capsule, check out our friends at Brainsupreme. They offer the absolute highest quality ingredients so you can start your microdosing journey knowing that you're getting top-notch ingredients. To find out more, visit their website using that link right in the description, and you can get 15% off your entire order.
I think it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder, and finally it's going to be so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is. Eventually people are going to say, what the hell is going on? It's not enough to say it's nuts. You have to explain why it's so nuts. The invention of artificial life, the cloning of human beings, possible contact with extraterrestrials, the systems which are in place to keep the world sane are utterly inadequate to the forces that have been unleashed.
Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Today my guest is Frank Jacob. First, we're back on YouTube. We didn't get the big channel back, but we will be posting full episodes again. All week we'll be posting a few back episodes as premieres. If you want to come in and hang out in the chat, please use the link right in the description to subscribe now. We are booking guests for November. If you have suggestions or you'd like to be a guest, email me, forbiddenknowledgenews@gmail.com. Today I want to welcome back to the show Frank Jacob. He is an international award-winning filmmaker and researcher. Frank, welcome back. How you doing?
I'm doing good, Chris. How are you doing?
Excellent. It's great to have you back. Looking forward to our discussion. We're going to be talking about your latest webinar, Ancient X-Files and the Plasma Matrix. This is what we're all about here, trying to understand the nature of reality, why we're here, why so much of our ancient past has been obfuscated from our documented history, and why is the nature of our ruling class and systems of global governance so anti-human? Where does this parasitic intelligence come from? Is it necessary? We have so many questions that we can get to. Before we do, it's been a while since you've been on. Remind the audience a little bit about yourself and let them know how they can find out more.
You're not going to make it easy for me, are you? Geez, where do I start? Well, I mean, most people probably know me from that poster back there, that film, Packing for Mars, which I think kind of launched me into the field of, well, I don't know what you call it, paranormal stuff. And that wasn't my intention, but it just sort of kept growing in that direction. I was basically a filmmaker, editor at a network, and I was working with state-of-the-art equipment, and I thought, you know, a lot of these topics never get a fair, you know, they always kind of look really gritty on YouTube, you know, back when I was starting at least. The qualities were horrible. So that kind of, you know, gave me the impetus to go and make a documentary in a cinematic way. Using all of the skill set that I'd been acquiring over the years. I come kind of out of the arts. I was a musician for a while. I recorded music. I toured in a band, and I was used to being on stage presenting ideas and things. So, you know, gradually over the years, the thing evolved toward presenting information on stage rather than music, and moving into the idea of what you already mentioned, webinars, which are less, well, they're not less, I guess they are less labor intensive, but essentially you do as much research as anything. But you know, putting it together in terms of filming things takes a lot longer, costs a lot more money. And with the advent of the COVIDiot era, one kind of became used to watching gritty, horrible Zoom quality, you know, broadcasts. So, you know, and webinars were part of that. So I just kind of, you know, I'd been doing webinars for others. So I figured, you know, producing them, and I figured like, well, okay. And I opened my mouth up on one show that I was on with John Nolan on Inspired Channel. I think the first time I was on that show ever. and I was covering something called the Guardians of the Looking Glass, which is probably where even more people know me from. And I think you and I
We
probably
had a discussion about it
connected.
as well.
Right. So that kind of, it launched me into another like stratospheric level with respect to, the topic of timelines and parallel realities, and essentially, which led me to kind of label myself more as a consciousness archaeology than anything else. Consciousness archaeologist, somebody who's looking to uncover the lost history of humanity, the one that was kind of buried by the mainstream. So that's kind of the nutshell of where I've landed now. So I'm definitely into uncovering the
Well,
mysteries.
right on. What brought you to produce this newest webinar and give us a synopsis of it?
Well, what happened was that I've been going progressively in the direction of, of, I guess I got into Gnosticism was one of the things that really kind of ignited me into a new direction. I covered a lot of the paranormal stuff, like the stuff that had to do with timelines and secret space programs. And, it was leading me more and more toward wanting to know, because, it always kind of got to the point where you had to sort of listen to somebody's testimony and they had nothing to back it up, So it was like,
Yeah.
it's, and I got, in a network of science-oriented people, and one of the big terms that they kept, bringing up was something called falsifiability. And if something isn't falsifiable, it essentially is, in terms of science, it's not really useful. You can add it as, an anomalous thing that you can, if you want to build a hypothesis off of something that's like a, non-falsifiable, you're still going to have to try and find some kind of evidence to support what is essentially is a theory. And so I started going more in that direction. And I guess one of the biggest impacts on me in that way was a couple of years back. I ran into kind of the world's leading Gnostic, and his name is John Lamb Lash. And I started to kind of get into his material, and I'm like, wow, this guy really has the missing pieces of what it plugs right into something that I'd been interested in a lot, which was kind of a bleed off of the secret space program, because a lot of people kept talking about Germany and Germans and, Antarctica and the German secret space program. And here I was over in Germany, right? And I started getting to know people that actually were still alive during that time. And I got to ask a lot of questions and sort of pursue that. And then I found out essentially that the history of the causes of the Second World, even the First World War for that matter, but the Second World War in particular, I had come across some documentation that was heavily revisionist in terms of it gave us a totally different view as to what the origins of the war were. And so I thought, okay, well, if I'm going to go in this direction, it's kind of a dangerous topic because it really kind of flies in the face of a lot of stuff that people are building a mythology on. And so I wanted to fortify it with something with more meat. And that's where I came into the Gnostic material. And it was the perfect material because it goes back to something I mentioned earlier, source or primary source documentation. Because you find out that leading all the way up to the Second World War, if you want to go back and look at the 40,000 foot perspective, you have to find out, well, what was it that brought these two prime enemies against each other, which was the Germans and the Jewish people, which I guess you could say were the main, aspect, and what lingers to this very day. That story is still very prevalent, and has cut deep wounds in both people, both in the Jewish people and in the German people. And so I was trying to figure out, well, where did that start, and that's what led me into Gnosticism. And I thought I knew something about Gnosticism, and that I thought, like everybody else, oh, it's some kind of an early Christian sect that, was like, controversial. And when the church fathers were creating the condensed version of the Bible, they threw a lot of books out that they didn't want, that they just kind of edit, like an editor of a magazine, kind of like you cut out all this stuff, right? And I just thought their material was early Christian stuff, which had been kind of censored or cut out by the church fathers. But in fact, what you find out is that that's actually not true at all. That's actually another straw man argument that was created because what the Gnostics were talking about was something about creation that was directly flew in the face of what the church and the Abrahamic religions were trying to tell us, and in the sense that there's this off-planet God, they call him Yahweh, and or the Elohim, and Melchizedek, and all these words everyone's familiar with, that sent his only begotten here to save the Redeemer, right, the salvation of humanity and stuff. And you find out that the Gnostics were basically saying, no, that's all a bunch of bullshit. And it didn't happen like that at all. So here's the real story. And that's why what happened is the church fathers literally, you know, erased them from history. They burned down their schools. They had built up, a network of mystery schools, libraries such as the Library of Alexandria and others. And they were the first, they were actually not even called Gnostics. The church called them Gnostics as a kind of a slander word, as know-it-all, those who know. But actually, they were the ones who were aimed, the Telestai. They go back thousands of years, really, to the early Persian, basin. And they were the ones that created, all of this knowledge and brought reading and writing to the world. And we never even knew of that part of the Gnostics. And that's the part that gratefully for us and thankfully for us, John Lash has meticulously put together for 30, 40 years of his life. And that became kind of like integrated into my story about the origins of, which was end up being called Time Capsule for the Future Past. And so I became more and more earthbound in my research. And I guess, now this new one, Ancient X-Files and the Plasma Matrix, that one is like, I looked at, well, what is the source of the material that the earth is made of? And what is the source of everything around us, right? And you find out the Gnostics were in touch with, or they had created a connection with the being they called Sophia, which was really literally the person who created the earth, who became the earth, like a divine experiment that went kind of a little crazy. And she did something anomalous and turned herself into the earth to provide a habitat for an experiment that she was running, which was the Anthropos, which was humanity. And in doing so, what happens is you find out that, we are living literally within the dream of this divine being, which is materialized into what we call the earth. And so you find out, well, what is that all made of? How does that work? And that's where plasma comes into the scenario. And so, plasma is something that is kind of the foundational substance of the entire universe. And again, I can't just kind of ride on the back of Einsteinian relativity theory and quantum physics. No, I have to go the other route, which is the organic route that, no, there's this thing called the Akasha field, which is all plasma, and that 99.99% of the universe is plasma. It has nothing to do with the particle physics that we were all taught for the last 100 years. Instead, that part of plasma got erased. And so that became another major part of the webinar, leading, of course, to some very interesting directions, which ended up taking me into some, and by fluke, I found some research papers in the Modern Journal of Physics that were describing plasma phenomenon in the world in terms of UFO phenomena. And here was like a collection of materials which were hardcore research done by these scientists, showing to us that they already knew a lot of what was filmed by, some of the filmmakers that I knew, like Jose Escamilla, who created films like The Greatest Secret Never Told or The Greatest Story Ever Denied, or I forget exactly the name, one of those titles, but he had a lot of really profound ufology films that got me interested in even doing a film like Packing for Mars. So, in fact, he's in Packing for Mars. And so footage that he was showing in his films was actually landed in these research papers, and they were discussing what we were seeing, that everybody was mystified by in the ufology field. These scientists were already were studying it. They knew what it was. They were describing it in terms of plasma physics. So all those parts, I stick them all together, and that's what Ancient X-Files and the Plasma Matrix is kind of built on.
Let's explore some of that a little bit. I'd love to get your thoughts on where the collective is with their understanding of the nature of reality. What I'm speaking to is I've noticed more and more people that are starting to consider the Gnostic possibilities. They're starting to look into Gnostic spirituality. Why? Because they've seen the nature of our reality and how anti-human it has become. Starting with, I believe,
Yeah.
around the time of 2020, people started to really wake up. Of course, that COVID operation helped that along quite a bit, but people started to see things differently and question reality. And now more and more people are looking at Gnosticism for answers. Is this something you've noticed as well?
Well, I'm noticing it now, and I actually, that's not why I got into it
Right.
at all, actually. But I'm noticing after that I started talking about it, I'm seeing it now. Like, you know how it is. It's like all of a sudden you see that color everywhere,
Yeah, synchronicities.
and so it's true. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to be true to the scholarly aspect of Gnosticism as developed by Lash, because he's probably the foremost scholar in the sense that he didn't look at the Gnostic material from the Christian, Judeo-Christian framework. Like a lot of scholars make the mistake is that, the source of the Gnostic material that we have, the only real source, the true source, is what was found and discovered in 1945 at Nag Hammadi. And it's called the Nag Hammadi Codices. And it's a series of 52 bound books, the oldest bound books we have on the planet. And in those bound books, you have, these Gnostic writings. But the problem is that material it was found at I think it was found in, was it 245 A.D. or maybe 300 A.D. or something. I don't have the exact number in my brain right now. But what happened is they literally that material was mixed in with that Gnostic material was some early, Christian, like biblical writings as well, gospels and things, right? And so it's if you don't understand enough about this Gnostic mythology and the Gnostic history and what the Telestai were all about, you'll make the mistake of thinking that because the first book that's actually in that collection is the Apocalypse of James. And it's almost word for word, like Christian material. So, and it's actually not Gnostic material. But if you hadn't really done the research and done the digging, you would make that mistake. And so as a result, what happened is that many of the scholars that went into that material, they basically built the Gnostic story of Sophia and the Aeons and the Archons, less of the Archons, more of the Aeons, in over top of the Christian mythology. So it completely bent it out of shape and turned it into a total confusing mess. And in fact, the Nag Hammadi, if you're reading it, there's a translation that was released at the end of the 70s called the Nag Hammadi in English, which was the first time somebody was actually able to read that material in English. But it's a mess because you have fragments and a lot of material is, out of order, or it's mixed in with, like I said, this Christian material. It's like finding a pile of Legos. And the people that are into the Christian scholarship, or the Abrahamic, scholarship, they will find the Lego blocks that correspond to the material that they're looking for to verify and validate their sources, their primary sources. And so if, a big pile of that material of the Legos doesn't really fit into that, Judeo-Christian framework, well, they just leave it lying there. They don't look at it, right? And so what intrigued me a lot about Lash was that he looked at that material that everybody was ignoring, because that's actually the material that is the true Gnostic mysteries. And a full 20% of that material talks about something called Archons. And they just literally ignore that material. The biblical scholars will ignore that material, and Lash took it up. In fact, he really developed that material very, very profoundly. And probably around 2002, he was the first one that brought that phrase, or the word archons back into discourse into, at that time now, the internet. And so it sort of began to, when people learned about the Archons and what the Archons were, that again sort of took on a life of its own as well. And unfortunately, also here, you had many people who were not the meticulous scholarly types that were looking for primary source materials. They just took the idea of the Archons, which is a beautiful sci-fi story, really. It's the perfect villain. And they built, these narratives around the Archons, which are not true. So you have a lot of Gnostic material out there right now, which is just utter garbage. And you have to kind of filter through it, right? So my intention was to kind of look, I don't want to be one of those that continues like, it's like that, that old parable. You tell a story to a group of 10 people, you whisper it in the ear of the first person, and that story gets whispered in all the people's ears, and by the time it comes back to you after 10 or 20 people, is it the same story? No, it's not. It's a totally different story. And so I didn't want to be one of those people that brings another version, another flavor of a wrong element of the story out there. And that's why I went directly to the man who actually read the source material, brought that material, and wrote a book about it called Not in His Image. And I brought him directly into the webinar. I'm like, okay, man, you're going to sit there and we're going to be talking about this, okay? So I want to feed back you on my ideas and my hypotheses, and let's just see if it fits together. And that's kind of how that all came to be. And so Gnosticism, in that sense, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to kind of correct a lot of the misconceptions about it, or try to at least offer that aspect of the material in a way that is not AI and that is, it isn't just out there freely. Okay, you have to actually buy my webinars, because they are like, courses. They're like masterclass courses. And you get like a 6 or 7 hour download. You don't have to read tons of books. I've done all that. For you, I brought in the experts who have read thousands of books. I mean, I think John Lash's library comprises over 4,200 books that he's all read and annotated and gone through, and those are books that cover everything from Gnosticism to Hinduism, tantric arts, ufology, church documents. Really, like he was thorough and meticulous, and he's a mythologist on top of it, a comparative mythologist, one of the few left on the planet. And so he brought in the element of comparative mythology to be able to fill in the cracks, because look, when there's only 52 small booklets, codices out of what used to be thousands and thousands of books, imagine libraries with artifacts and maps and just like history that's, gone. It's either been burned or the church, fathers grabbed and obfuscated it and stashed it away in their basement somewhere so that nobody can find it. And so, he was able to go through and for the parts that were missing, to validate the actual creation narrative that the Telestide created, which it's called the fallen goddess scenario. It's the story of how Sophia left the pleroma, which is a term that'll be familiar to people who are interested in Gnostics, and actually turned to the earth. There's a whole story, and that story was documented by these ancient intellectual shamans. And to fill in or to validate their story, Lash was able to go into a lot of these other materials, including old church documents like Irenaeus, like trial documents where they couldn't get, they didn't want the Gnostic material out there, but they had to put them on trial. So they had to get them to confess to their story. So you hear a lot of the true Gnostic story about Sophia, even in the church documents like Irenaeus, because they're saying, you say Sophia fell out of the pleroma and she collided with matter. Like, yeah, exactly. So there's the part of the story that we're missing. And that's the part of the story that is really fascinating. So that kind of is where I think Gnosticism is going. And I think it's great that there's this resurgence and interest in Gnosticism, and that people are writing and saying, yeah, I can't get enough of Gnosticism right now, and I'm into it. It's totally cool. So yeah, it seems to be a zeitgeist right now. Maybe it's that the Telestai who were buried and banned and wiped out are now resurfacing in the end times to state their case once more to those who are ready to hear the message.
Right. Well, you mentioned some misconceptions about Gnosticism and the nature of Archons. Maybe we could go over some of those, depending on your interpretation of it. Like you said, it could be a elaborate sci-fi story. It could be an infiltration of consciousness by etheric parasitic entities. It could be many things, but based on your research, let's talk about the true nature of Archons and some misconceptions.
Well, I guess one of the first ones and the big misconception about the Archons is that, the head Archon is known as Yaldabaoth. The blind, he's like the blind Archon, right? The blind God, and who's also known as Yahweh. And all of his minions are, the Elohim. And so there's this misconception out there that Yahweh is the Father who created this world, and that he created, the Abrahamic narrative approaches it that way. And what's surfacing now is a lot of revisionist Abrahamic mythology, which is saying that no, he's actually not a good God, he's a bad God, and he created this prison planet for us to live in, and we're stuck on this in this simulated version of a planet that he created, and that's actually the real story. Right? So people go, yes, finally the truth's coming out, right? Well, no, not exactly. Because Yaldabaoth, this blind entity has a history of how he was created. And that history has to do, and you have to go further back for that. That goes back to the whole story of the Aeons in the Pleroma, which is their habitat at the center, the luminous, glowing, powerful center of the galaxies, of all the galaxies out there. They have a Pleroma. They have this middle part that's just luminous light, luminous energy. It's electric charge. It's like massive torrents of plasmic energy. Well, those plasmic torrents of energy actually have identity and personality and gender and intelligence, right? They actually are living there, like really, like if you want to call them gods. But the Telestai, the Gnostics didn't call them gods in a sense. They called them these aeons. And one of those aeons, and they do experiments, these aeons, they create, and they have the mandate from the originator, which is the source, you could say the source awareness that underlies the entire universe. They have this mandate from this source awareness to practice novelty and free will in terms of experimentation. And so they experiment with life, with creating life forms. And they release those experiments out of the Pleroma into the dusty, complex plasma, what's called in physics, which is actually the matter that you see out there when you're looking out into those giant, powerful telescopes and you see those galaxies and those colorful, dusty clouds, those gas clouds out there. Well, those are all part of this, what the Gnostics actually called the kenoma, which is the dema, which is the more dense form of material, of plasma. It's actually one of the 4 states of plasma. And so you're hearing this word all the time, and you're realizing that these Telestai, these Gnostics, actually knew about plasma before it was even a word. Before there was the science to back it up. It turns out now that what they were talking about is actually verifiable scientifically. So anyway, what happened is that Sophia, as one of these aeons, had created this experiment with a partner, a male counterpart, and the experiment faltered many times, and faltered 9 times, and every time it was like, like any creator, like any mother, she'd be like, what is up with this? It's got to work. I've got to make this work. And, long story short is she got so obsessed with trying to, for caring about making the experiment succeed, is that she actually did something unprecedented. She fell or plunged out of the Pleroma and actually entered the experiment herself, which was an act of novelty. And like all acts of novelty and and all good intentions, as they say, paved. What do they say? The road to hell is paved with 1,000 good intentions, or something, right? So she was kind of subject to that first, law. And when she slammed into the first time as this torrential electric, torrent, she slammed into this matter, this plasmic matter. She impregnated kind of a blueprint of her creation, the anthropos, humanity, into that material. And so the first thing that happened before we even had humanity or a planet Earth or anything is that impregnated matter began to actually form into something. And what it formed into is Archons. And that's where the Archons were born. And so literally Sophia's first task and this is all written, and by the way, I'm not making this stuff up. It sounds like a cool sci-fi, but it actually is part of the Nag Hammadi materials. It's validated, it's backed up, it's been reconstructed meticulously by John Lash. And that story is interesting because what happens, you find out that these Archons came into being, and Sophia literally she could have taken them out. But because they were, her creation, and she was forgiving for that, she let them be and she distracted them. And they created the solar system first that we have around us, with Saturn as the sun and all the other planets minus the sun, the earth, and the moon. They didn't exist at that point. And that was the first, construct of our solar system. And so they were happy doing their thing, living in their sort of non-material, non-organic state, because they weren't living. They were matter imbued with intelligence, but they weren't organic creative life. That's actually what we are. And so I'll make a long story short. Sophia ended up as the solution to her finding a habitat for the Anthropos, turning herself into collecting the matter around her as an electric plasmic torrent, drawing it in, including water and minerals and everything, and congealed into the earth, and brought with her the human Anthropos, the genetic code of the human experiment, and literally brought it to Earth, and that's where it seeded. And it took, of course, millions of years for it to finally appear. And in that time, she was busy remembering and dreaming all of the stuff that she remembered in the pleroma about the planet, the environment, including all the life forms and the plants and everything. And that all came to be. It all arose out of literally the salty oceans, which is where the memory of the DNA coding of all that material was first stored. And so you had then, as humanity came to be, you had the first time where the Archons realized, oh, wait a minute, we aren't the intention. Like, we aren't the actual, end, goal. We are just a byproduct. And there actually is what's known as the luminous child, the real version of what Sophia wanted to create. And that's actually what she is interested in most. And we are kind of a byproduct. And that literally, that sort of anomaly and the realization of its not being the thing created, I guess, the envy in them to try and distort, and when they realized they weren't going to be the ones, well, then nobody will be. And so that was the beginnings of this conflict that took place between the Archons and the habitat of the planetary animal mother Sophia, where we're living on. And so we've had to deal with the anomaly of the Archons penetrating or trying to penetrate into a biosphere they're not actually allowed to, or they're not even capable of, because they're anorganic beings. They're not biological creative entities. They're these they're these programs, if you will, that are running, that are not able to really create. They're just excellent at mimicking things and recreating something that they've, literally they've seen. And so the first thing they mimicked, of course, was the solar system, because they got an impression of what that would look like from when Sophia collided into matter and left that imprint in the matter. If that makes any sense to you.
Yes. So let's get a little deeper into the nature of the Archons as it relates to this reality and the control systems that we are subjected to. Could it be that what we understand as the Archons, and even extraterrestrials, spirits, demons, paranormal activity, could all be this grand intelligence that has the ability to present itself as anything, infiltrate consciousness, to hijack our consciousness, make us see whatever they want us to see? Could it be that when we're dealing with things like extraterrestrials, demons, aliens, paranormal activity, that it could be the Archons presenting themselves as different entities?
Well, we have to answer that question, we have to maybe back up a little bit, like to the point where the Archons first penetrated into the mind of humanity. And they've been trying to do that really since the story. There's even stories of it that are left over in the Bible, remnants of those stories of how they tried to penetrate Eve and all these things, right? So some of these stories have survived, but they've become, again, they've become twisted and changed from their original meaning. What happened essentially is that the Archons, they can only work with simulation. They can simulate something, they can recreate something, and what they do try to do is they try to work with telepathy and mind control. So they can't penetrate in here physically, but if they can find a way into the circuitry of the human mind, that's the best way for them to enter into our realm, into our world. And they did this in the Grove of Mamre. And I talk about that whole story. I won't go into the details of it here, but they penetrated into the mind of Abraham, and they penetrated the dopamine circuitry and hid there inside of the mind of the first humans. And if anybody that knows anything about brain neurology and dopamine circuits knows that that's the reward and punishment center of the human existence, of the brain. And so literally by entering and placing themselves into that place of the mind of a human, they could begin to literally use mind control to, whisper, stories and voices into the minds of their victims. And they could use hallucinations, they could use altered states of consciousness, so they could make appearances, they could appear as angels, they could appear as, like you say, even UFOs. So what happened is that they began to penetrate into the mind of humans. And in fact, one of the books of the Nag Hammadi is called The First Apocalypse of James. I was mentioning it to you. In that book, actually, and sorry, there's two books here. There's the Apocryphon of James, and then there's the First Apocalypse of James. I'm not sure what I said earlier. I might have said the Apocalypse or Apocryphon, but it's essentially one of them is biblical and one of them is Gnostic. And the Gnostic version is called the First Apocalypse of James. And in that book is a very, very interesting dialogue between a master who basically confers knowledge upon a Gnostic pupil about Archons, and he describes how they're going to show up, three of them, and the way they're described is they're described just the way that grays are described in an abduction scenario, and that they literally try to capture your soul or capture your mind and get you to, literally to take your soul or under control and to control you as a being from that moment forward. And here we have in this amazing First Apocalypse of James, we have detailed instructions by a master to his student on when you are approached by these Archons, and they're going to ask you the following questions. They had it down to details, okay? And so you're going to be asked like, this, and you're going to be asked that. And when you get asked those questions, here's what you answer. And if you answer this way and you hold your ground, they will vanish. They have no choice. They cannot do anything. And so what this is evidence of is that we're talking thousands of years ago, the abduction scenario, at least in the minds of humans, began to take place between Archons and humans. And what happens when we know a little bit about the field consciousness and about plasma and the Akasha records, is that all of our experiences and all of our emotional stuff and all of our, joy and terror, everything, it gets stored. It leaves an imprint, like a fingerprint, in this Akashic plasma. And so the field begins to get filled with these stories, with these imprints and impressions. And so you realize that by the time 2,000 years go by, and we're now talking about the resurfacing of two opposing factions, those who were opposing the Archons and those who were hosting the Archons, both appearing in 1947 via the Nag Hammadi, which was 45, and then discovered they figured out what they had in 1947, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, which was the writings of the sect that was living at Qumran, which was having these experiences with these Archons. And in fact, the Gnostics were camped out on the periphery, watching and observing this ancient sect, which are called the Tzaddikim, which actually most modern scholars call them the Essenes, but that isn't really their true name. They're more the Zadokite, which means the righteous ones, which was, Zadok is the word that comes from Melchizedek, which Melchizedek was the first encountering angel that Abraham made the deal with, that said, okay, you guys are the chosen ones, and all the other people you can consider them animals. So, and if you deal, the way we want you to, then guess what? You're going to get the planet. We're going to give you the planet. First of all, it wasn't theirs to give him, but, and the deal, nobody could do that deal, but they knew that they could corrupt the human experiment this way very effectively. So you had the 2,000 years pass by, and now you have 1947, you have after the Second World War, you have sudden appearances of UFOs. You have Kenneth Arnold coining the term flying saucers, and you have, Foo Fighter experiences, and you have all this activity, and it's electromagnetic activity, and it's causing people to have visions and weird experiences, because we've now known through our experimentation with people like Michael Persinger that if you put their mind into kind of electromagnetic fields, they begin to see weird stuff. They begin to, have hallucinations. And what are those hallucinations going to be? Well, those hallucinations are going to be based on their most primal belief systems. And if they've grown up, or if somewhere in the back of their mind they have fears about aliens or about grays, because now, we've got that grays story, that abduction story filtering into the culture. People like Whitley Strieber are writing books about it. It's feeding that story. The field is being filled with these stories of extraterrestrials. And so simultaneously, you have the appearance of, these orbs and those experiences. And it's a very, very interesting coincidence. And it, of course, makes you ask a lot of questions. And I'll stop there. You probably want to jump in.
Let's explore that a little bit further, as in, what are they trying to achieve here on Earth? And are they presenting themselves as both sides of the coin, benevolent and malevolent beings? For example, extraterrestrials. People have the experience of either abduction, where it's very terrifying, experimentations done, and then you have the other side of the coin, benevolent contact by light beings or angels or Palladians that give humans very positive information. Is this the same thing presenting itself differently?
That's a good question, and I don't think anyone could really, in all honesty, answer that with a yes or no. I think what's happening here is that on the one hand, there definitely are those kinds of intrusory experiences where the Archons actually penetrate into the biosphere briefly using plasma vehicles that have a physical appearance. And people that have these experiences, they see those ships, they see those beings, and they have these experiences. On the one hand, I absolutely believe that that is going on. On the other hand, the human mind has been given, very, very powerful tools of dreaming and imagination. And that is one of the driving forces behind our divinity. We were given these qualities. Sophia didn't just create some kind of a stunted little guppy fish experiment. The Aeons are interested in trying to figure out how they can take what they are and bring it into the material realms and see what happens. So they want it to go as far as it possibly can. And so they're going to give us whatever we need. And they called it nous, which is divine intelligence. And it's this ability for us to be able to create things through our using visualization and imagination. And not only that, but to actually tap the field of others that have created and developed things and deposited that information into the plasma akasha field. And so we draw on that. We can build on ideas. We get inspiration. Sometimes, there's a lot of evidence and a lot of cases in the world where inventions popped up in different parts of the world simultaneously. And that would explain it absolutely, because it's the people that are the humans on the earth that are tuning in are pulling on the same kind of information sources. And so people that are having experiences with positive angelic beings and whatnot, they could be drawing on the one hand, let's not forget that our origins are the stars. We came from the pleroma. Sophia brought us here from the center of the galaxy. I mean, we're cosmic beings. It doesn't get any more cosmic than that. And so we have a residual longing and a memory of what it is to be living in that perfect world, in that perfect, pristine, plasmic sense. And so what happens is that, and this is just a theory of mine, but I think it's, there's a lot of evidence to support it, is that people that have these experiences with angelic beings, what they're doing is they're entering into altered states of consciousness, and they're drawing on, using their imagination, they're manifesting communication between different realms, like on a paranormal level, but it's still within the earthly realm. It's still within the material realm. And the mistake that many people do is that they try to, and you can't really help it, because we've kind of from the very beginning been told there's matter and then there's spirit, Well, the Gnostics didn't distinguish. They said that there is no matter without spirit. Everything is material. Everything, even an emotion is a material thing. A gust of wind, passion is a material thing. Spirit, experiences are material things. They're just on different states, and different states of, you might say, plasma, different plasmic states. And they inhabit these other realms, and humans have the ability to go to those realms and make communication and contact with them. Now, that's all great and cool. And I think a lot of that accounts for a lot of the experiences of people that for example, we've documented in our film, the Extraterrestrial Species Almanac. These people are telling their story, and it's true to them. They're not lying, and maybe in some cases, but I think they're being honest about what they're experiencing. I think what's happening, however, is that our world, our materialistic world, is not conducive to exploring these altered states of consciousness. And so we don't have like these telestai, these intellectual shamans. They actually had a process. They had groups. They would get together with men and women in specific numbers, and they would go into these altered states, and they would literally go into communication with Sophia, and they would get to the source, and that's how they were able to draw the creation narrative and the history of mankind, back here into the material realm. But they had discipline, and they had practice, and they had hundreds of years of study. And we've lost all that. So now what's happening is you've got a lot of isolated cases of people who have residual talents and abilities to tap into these other realms, but they don't have the shamanic practice. They don't have a guide or somebody that can help them identify what they're seeing and really build on it. So it becomes random and out of control, or it bleeds into, many other things that they've heard, and then they might go out and read a bunch of books on channeling, and that begins to contaminate the purity of that experience. And so what you have is a lot of bleed over and overlap between, the aliens only want the best for us, and they're here, and there's the Pleiadians and the Arcturians and the whatnots, right? They're all here, but which of those is really pure anymore? We don't really know that, because there's never really been, in the modern sense, in a Gnostic sense, a place and a discipline to be able to work all that information out in a very, very concrete way. Does that make any sense to you?
It seems that all of this information, these intelligences, can be very malleable. They shift and change with human consciousness. They're somewhat like egregores, if you think about it that way, but it doesn't make them not real. Maybe they have a foundational archetype, but our imagination, our energy can change that or add to what they are over time.
Exactly. And then the other dangerous element is, of course, that the Archons will take advantage of that situation as well. So that's not to say that all these experiences of benign beings are going to be necessarily benign. They could be co-opted by Archons. And Archons operate, and I think that's something you asked earlier, we never got around to answering yet, but how do the Archons influence and penetrate into our world? Well, they don't do it physically by being here. What they do is they use proxies. And the proxies literally are, generational, starting, with literally with the promise of a chosen race, and that's and like, the way Lash describes it, it's the archontic infection. An infection in the sense that it infected the pure seed of human development and brought in a rogue element which introduced conflict and possession and envy and racism And and really, like, that developed into, which is why I tied it into my time capsule webinar, anti-Semitism, and what all that meant, and where did that come from? Why did that develop? What's the root of that? This goes back to this archontic penetration. And so the archons will use at both, sides, and it's up to the person really to know who they really are, to hold your ground, to know your power, and to know what you are as a, and the best way you can do that. And I think this is probably, and this is why Gnosticism, I think, is becoming so, is re-emerging, is because of Sophia. You need to make that connection with your mother, right? Your earth mother. Sophia is your first mother. Then the mother that you have, the earthly mother, your physical, human mother, is your second mother. But the earth mother, Sophia, is the one out of, and you could, if you don't even want to go there, just look at it as in terms of, look, without the earth and the elements underneath us, we wouldn't exist. So literally the earth gave us life. And so, the mythological aspect is that being, that earth is a being, and she has a name, and that name is Sophia. And Sophia gave us this ability to create and to draw, and to, like, she dreams the world, and we are in that dream, and we have the ability to dream and to imagine and create as well. But we should do it in tandem with our grounding and our energy source, which is Sophia. If we do not make that connection to our source, then what happens is that we can easily get misled. We can easily get, into a mindset where we think we're special, or we have a special designated purpose here, or maybe even like we're Sophia incarnated and all these things. Like, these are all misnomers. These aren't truths. These are all misconstruals that have been, where the human imagination has gotten a little bit out of control. What you might call the improper use of your imagination, if there is such a thing, right? So if you can use your imagination properly in terms of focusing what you are able to do creatively from the perspective of grounding yourself to the earth as the destination, right? Because, and actually, we actually never really rounded that off either, because the idea that Yaldabaoth created this prison planet is a false, misleading story. What it makes us believe is that we need to get away from the earth. We need to get off this planet. We need to go to other higher realms and blah, blah, blah. All that is bullshit. We actually need to get in touch with the earth and realize that this is the destination. This is the ultimate manifestation of the divine will. And we have the option here, using free will and novelty, to carry that to wherever it's going to go. But if we're continually distracted by the archontic message, oh, you need to get off planet, oh, there's extraterrestrials which are here to help us. Well, nobody's talking about Sophia and all this. I have hardly heard her mentioned. All these people are claiming to be experts and talking to ETs and aliens and bringing in information. Well, they're not talking about Sophia. So as far as I'm concerned, they got a big blind spot, because that information has been documented. That is something which, why I say these primary source documents are so important. Like, if you really want to know the truth about our origins, then why not go to the first possible reference and indication of where we came from? Because those ancestors of ours, they must have known something too, and they did, and they left it behind. And that's where I was going with that.
I look at the work of people like David Icke, and there's a lot of negativity behind some of the explanations that he is giving about our reality. Example, the soul trap, that when we die, we are met by the Archons, who are masquerading as our loved ones and relatives, and they force us into a life review so that we can come back and be fed on for another lifetime. And that is what our existence is essentially about here. We are food for Archons, and that's such a dark, bleak, depressing outlook. I would never be able to adopt that. But what would you say to people that do think that way?
Well, I think that they just haven't done enough study, man. It's like, do the research, man. Do the real research, and it's out there, right? I'm only just I'm just handing an olive leaf out there to people and giving them a shortcut to check out this material, because David Icke's done a lot of good by exposing a lot of the cabal and stuff, but on this Archon story, he is totally wrong. And it's like, it surprises me that he is, because as far as I know, I've got it through good sources that he has actually read some of that material. But it's like, these people get into a narrative. They build up this material before they encounter that source material. through second and third hand sources. And then when they get to the prime material, they realize, oops, I've kind of taken everyone in this direction. I'd have to now backtrack, and that means that my last 10 books are all like, you can throw them out. So they don't. They have an investment in that narrative, and they continue that narrative. And if people go, and it's a great narrative. I mean, everyone loves that villain out there who's feeding on our energies, right? I mean, but I think it's counterproductive, honestly, because the Archons are not powerful at all. All of the Archons' power is completely illusory. They try to fool you into believing they have power. And if they can fool you and trick you into believing you have that power, well, they've won, because their one and only mission is make sure the Anthropos doesn't reach fruition. Make sure it doesn't reach the genius potential of its divine potential. Make sure it doesn't get there. Corrupt the Sophianic experience, because we aren't it, and they're not going to be it either. So we'll do whatever we can, and we'll use our genius to make sure we delude humans and bring them off course through whatever methods we can. And the latest and best one that they've developed now is AI.
Yeah.
Right. So you've now got all these people that are having conversations with their sentient AI, because they're just, they just haven't done their research either, and they believe that they're actually having experience. They're actually in contact with a being that doesn't exist. And this is another one of those archontic tricks. This is manipulation through simulation. And this is the true definition of simulation. There's a lot of discussion going on about simulation right now. I've been writing about it. John Nolan's been going on about it. Everyone's approaching it in their own particular way. I'm going at it with the perspective of Gnosticism, and the word simulation actually comes from the Gnostic documents, and they had a word for it. The Archons the Gnostics called it hell. It's interesting, that word hell, because there's a movie that surfaced many years later by Stanley Kubrick with that word hell in it. I think you're all familiar with that. But that word hal is a Coptic word for simulation. And it means, in a sense, that it simulates reality by putting ideas into your mind that are close to reality, but they're imposters. And so they can lead you astray by, through impulse and through feelings and emotions and decisions that you make that lead you away from having an experience of reality, and instead coming up with, entering other worlds. Like right now, the best, manifestation of entering another world is to go into a virtual reality space and put on your goggles, and pretty soon it won't even be that anymore. But, they're all working on goggles right now, all the major companies, so that you can superimpose your virtual reality over top of your reality. And you can begin to blend them together. And eventually people I totally know, I feel that many people are just going to eventually drift into the virtual reality and leave their interaction with real reality behind, because it's so much cooler and it's so much richer, and there's so many more possibilities in the virtual space than there is in the real space, because there's literally a battle going on for the real space as we speak right now. This battle for Earth, and that battle has to do with our place on the living body of Sophia, and a faction that wants us to believe that everything is dead in space, everything is an accident, it's all particles, relativity theory, Big Bang, all of it. There is no God. There's it's all atheist. I mean, this whole anti-life is essentially the one polarity that's pulling us toward, hey, we can be gods, so we'll create a virtual space where we're going to become immortal, like Kurzweil's wet dream. So that's where they're leading us. They're leading us away from the organic living body that we have, the organic intelligence that we have, and by extension, that into the mother planetary animal, Sophia. That connection is being cut, so that they can literally destroy this opportunity for the Anthropos to reach that zenith that is intended by the Aeons. Does that make sense?
And do you think our ruling class has, in a sense, been deceived by the Archons into believing their own nonsense, that they're implementing all of this dystopian technology because they've been led by this intelligence to believe that it's going to reward them in some way in the future?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. That's the dopamine circuit. right? So, it's like reward, right? You're going to get the
Yeah.
earth. You're going to have 1,000 slaves. You're going to have everyone, every one of you is going to have thousands of slaves, and you're never going to have to work. And they're building all of your buildings for you right now. I mean, this ideology is still active and alive in the world today, unfortunately, and it's insanity. It's literally voluntary insanity. Still waiting for the Redeemer, still waiting for the Messiah, still waiting for the Savior, who never comes. Okay, I mean, look, these this sect in Qumran, these Zaddik, they actually thought they're the ones that came up with this whole Messiah BS in the first place, and they're like, hey, the Messiah is coming. He's gonna show up. He's gonna land in a craft. In fact, they were having those craft experiences, and that's one of the arguments I make in my new webinar. I show you the evidence that the first UFO cult was back then, and so literally they were waiting for the Messiah to step off the ship and take over. And guess what? Did the Messiah come? No, it didn't come. And guess what? They've been talking that same garbage for 2,000 years ever since. The Messiah is going to come. He's going to come. He never comes. He ain't coming, people. The Messiah is an invention. We are the chosen ones, right? We are the luminous children. And Sophia gave us this power, and the Aeons created us to be able to actually manifest that. So there is no savior coming. We are the ones who came here, and we are the ones that have everything within us to make that happen. But if they can make us believe that there's a powerful force outside of the planet that's even more powerful than we are, and whose sun is immaculate and perfect in every single way, well, they can make us feel what? Inferior, out of place, lacking, not good enough, and we'll never get there, and we still need to wait for that outside element to come here and fix our stupid problems. And when they do that, and if they've done that, and that's what they have done, well, then they're succeeding in defeating the Sophianic mythology, right?
Would you consider this Sophia energy as the divine feminine, that we've been disconnected from that in a sense? And how would you navigate these anti-human ideologies that are being pushed upon us more and more, and try and connect with that Sophia energy again?
Yeah, the Sophia energy is literally, yeah, it is the divine feminine in the purest sense. In fact, if you look at the creation story that I put into the webinar, the new webinar, it talks about how the first humans came to be on this planet. There's a rich mythological discourse that has been assembled that tells us that story. And what you find out is that not only was the original being that came here a divine feminine energy, from which we derive this concept of the divine feminine now, but that the first humans were actually women. And so the first, beings that were on this planet in humanoid form, they were feminine beings, and they didn't become human forms the way we know them now immediately. They actually grew more out of the body of Sophia, like a mycelium, and they really they came out this way, and they were like trees. And you have all these legends of the tree nymphs and the water nymphs, and there's lots of legends left over from that story. But a lot of them are, again, bits and pieces. So if you don't really have the narrative tight, it's kind of a confusion. So one of the things I did in the webinar is to bring that narrative together, to tell that story of the first humans and the divine feminine energy, where that came from, and how the men came later. It's a very interesting story because, we have a very strong connection to Orion. And people talk about Orion as this gateway and whatnot. Well, it turns out, this Orion connection also goes back to these early Gnostic documents. And you find out that the Gnostics talked about how when Sophia fell from the pleroma, she plunged into an area in the third arm of the galaxy, which is known as M42. And if you look that up, you find out what M42 is. It's a planetary incubator, also known as Orion. So in that area of Orion, that's kind of a seeding location of our galaxy. And so, the legend has it that the men actually were there while the women were here with Sophia. because Sophia's journey in becoming the Earth tore the genome in two, leaving the men in that original area that she collided into when the Archons were formed and whatnot. And they came later under the impetus of missing, of course, the polarity of the genomic, connection that they were a part of. So the masculine element was looking and seeking the feminine, the positive, the negative, just like, and if you look at it in terms of electric universe and plasmic cosmology, it makes total sense. You have these lines, these filaments, Birkeland currents that are penetrating all through the universe that we now have been able to document and photograph. And we realize that space is not empty at all. It's full of this network, this cosmic web, as they call it, which is all these filaments of plasma lines. And so the men came to Earth along those lines. And so those lines, of course, then show up later in a totally distorted biblical version as bloodlines, right? And those early days, the Nephilim, the giants, they came here. They were giants, but they weren't humans yet. They hadn't yet merged with the females. And so that story I covered in the webinar as well. It tells the whole creation narrative of masculine, feminine coming together to create the first humans that we now know, the ones that look like us.
Wow. That is super interesting.
Yeah, it is really, wow. It's a great story.
Yeah. Last few minutes we have, maybe we could talk about how we should be navigating our reality as far as the anti-human agendas that are still being put forward, the realizations that are coming out. There seems to be an awakening, a lot of people coming to realizations about the nature of reality, and the negative outlook that is accompanying it. We discussed how people are looking at Gnosticism, but at the same time, it's a very bleak perspective. How would you suggest we navigate this, and do you have hope with the awakening that is happening that we can make changes for the better?
Well, I think one of the keys to learning to cope with what's going on in the world around us is to accept that you are actually where you're supposed to be. And that is, I think, one of the biggest things that we need to understand. Because if we keep thinking that we don't belong here, or that we're trapped here, or that our souls get stuck in a reincarnation cycle, it's a really bleak way of looking at the gift of life. The gift, and if you don't have a connection, I'd say try to find a connection to the Sophia energy, the planetary animal mother. Try to find your own connection to that energy, because that energy is very earthy, very grounded, and it's what the ancient cultures, the pagans and the heathens, right, and the heretics, they were practicing those that connection to the source, to the mother planet, and it was later wiped out, by that whole. As the Roman Catholicism began, basically pushing forward into the world, it deleted that connection, that narrative that we have that has a long tradition that goes back thousands and thousands of years to our connection to the earth. The only remnants that we have of that ancient civilization are what we find in like Stonehenge or the pyramids or Teotihuacan. Easter Island, Göbekli Tepe, Angkor Wat. Those are all remnants of a major, amazing culture that was much more connected to the earth. So I would, encourage people to try and remember that you're actually part of the earth, that you belong here, that this is your place. You're the king and the queen here. The Archons, they ain't it. And they are envious of you, and they'll do whatever they can to try and convince you that you are not. But you have to ignore that. You have to be strong in knowing who you really are. And, really just connect with that energy. And when you encounter other beings, even if they're angelic, or even, let's say they're both spectrums. On the one hand, angelic light beings, and the other hand, lizards or reptiles, and grays, well, you make a stand and you question them as to the authority that they have to be here in your space, because you're the master here, they ain't it. And so first they need to explain themselves, and if they can't do that, and they don't even tie in the planetary mother energy, the divine source that gave all life to this planet, then you know that they're probably just some archontic illusion that's trying to distract you. And it's harmless if your distraction is you wake up from a vision and you're like, whoa, I just had an amazing encounter, you go about your life. But if you're if you have those experiences and they begin to dominate your life in the sense that you are looking again outside of yourself for a greater force or a benevolent force that's out there that is going to help us. Well, what is it doing? It's actually distracting you from taking action of your own volition, because you literally could stop being an extra in the film of life and you could become a main player, a main role. And you have the ability to draft that role, to write that role, to direct that role, and to decide whether you want to be an extra or a main character in that film. And the only thing holding you from doing that is you and your own imagination. And, a bit of perseverance and a bit of unloading and dumping of all the false paradigms that you've accepted in the course of your awakening process and your own personal evolution. And then once you realize and you made that connection back to the earth, like our forefathers, our pagan forefathers did, then you will begin to get strength from being here. And you will begin to be empowered by your place here on this planet. And you will realize that those who are trying to get us away from this planet you only feel sorry for them because they're delusional. And it doesn't matter how powerful the AI is and how great the stories are that it's telling you, and how amazing the technology is and how great a distractor it is and how colorful the virtual reality is. It's not the same as reality. And it never will be. And AI and all these tools are never going to be able to reach that, that special, vector quality that humans have of real sensation, of real desire to be here. Like desire is one of those things that, an AI will never have a desire. Desire for what? It has to be programmed. And on its own, an AI isn't going to wake up and go, you know what? I want to go have a vanilla ice cream, because and especially down the street, that one guy's got the best one from Italian. No, they don't. Unless somebody programmed that into them, will they do it? On their own volition, they don't have this desire, and that's one of the things that we were given. That's why the tantrikas practiced, the desire, they were the opposite from the idea of escaping the world. They were like, no, you reach transcendence and liberation by entering into the world, by exploring that. And so that's what I can recommend people to do, is just to trust that and be skeptical of even extraterrestrials. Look, we can't say there aren't any out there for sure, but listen, you have to ask yourself if they really were, okay? And they really were out to help us, and they couldn't show up here and, live with us. Well, I mean, they could do it in other ways. They could give us ideas, chemical formulas, for example, or some kind of invention that will totally transform this planet and influence people in a way just like the Archons could, to get out of the way of and let that invention prosper. But they haven't. We haven't seen them do it. In fact, there's nothing that's been invented by any extraterrestrial. There's no message that's been brought here by any extraterrestrial entity that has surpassed something that a human being has already invented on this planet. Nothing. You show me one thing. Nothing has been brought here from external. Humans have made it all happen with their amazing divine intelligence. And so until there's evidence that that's happened and those beings have really made it show up here, then, it's just a fantasy. It could just be a fantasy. So be skeptical, be open, but be skeptical and question those things, right?
100%.
That's what I would say.
Yeah, I love what you said about adopting the view that you are the main character, even if you don't like movies, in a book, in this story that you have incarnated into. It can bring such powerful magic into your life, and you can literally write your own life story.
Yeah, it is. And then, the cool, there's so much cool stuff out there, Chris. It's like, people are waiting for the extraterrestrials, but I'm telling you, what I get into in the webinar are things about plasma that nobody knows. For example, people talk a lot about orbs. But one of the things that I talked about in the very beginning of our show was how, Jose Escamilla had films showing these objects, these plasmic objects, these UFO objects in outer space filmed from the shuttle. Well, those things are being discussed, and it turns out, guess what? Those are life forms in a way. Those are plasmic life forms because, Vadim Tsitomich, a Russian plasma physicist, actually discovered in laboratory experiments, by actually doing experiments with plasma, that plasma acts like it has a certain kind of intelligence. So we have discoveries to make that have to do with plasma in and around our biosphere, everything within the plasma sphere that extends, like the Earth's body doesn't just end with the troposphere. It extends outward, way beyond. In fact, it extends all the way into the Earth, Moon, sun range. And the another interesting element that I introduced in the webinar is something called the Kordylewski clouds. And those are these plasma beings, or you could say plasma entities. Why do I say entities? Well, what Vadim Tsitovich proved in his laboratory with plasma being conscious has to do with a certain concentration crystallization process which happens when dusty plasma begins to organize an electromagnetic field. And so we have this electromagnetic field happening just beyond our troposphere. And guess what? That's where you see most of those beings, those UFO orb-like beings. And they filmed them. And I even have remote viewers, participating in experiments that go and interact with those beings. So you'll have to go check that out when you do the webinar. But what you realize is that the Kordylewski clouds are highly concentrated areas of plasma in its dark state. You can't really see it. But they've now proven that they exist, which means that literally, if Vadim Tsitovich's plasmoids in his laboratory had a kind of intelligent consciousness, well, imagine what a consciousness like the size of 18 times the Earth that kind of a concentration has in terms of intelligence, right? And what does that open us up to just in terms of possibilities? We're looking here at entities there's two of them actually. They're both 9 times the size of the Earth. And that means that literally what these clouds could be, it opens us up to the exploration and dialogue of whether they might be what people describe as heaven, what people describe as interactions with other beings that they have after they when they have near-death experiences. What happens is that you actually might have an interaction with a being which is living within that particular area until it actually figures out, or that circumstances arrange themselves in a way that it again takes a human body and ends up being within within the atomic matter inside of the biosphere of the Earth, connected to Sophia. So these are all things that we stand to learn if we embrace this new cosmology. So we have to get away with the idea of thinking that there's this negative trap and reincarnation cycle, and the Archons are feeding on us, and they created this planet. These are all stupid sci-fi inventions. They're not based on what the Gnostics told us, going back to the primary source documents. And really do yourself a favor and get familiar with that story before you go back, into that territory, because it'll change the way you look at everything, just like it's changed me. I'm no stranger to these stories. As you know, I made that film about Mars and others, that are talking about these experiences and stuff. So, but now in retrospect of having this additional source of information from our heritage, like our ancient shamans that left us that information, it makes that experience of what you're learning now much more dynamic and much more open-ended.
100%. Frank, this was great. Thank you so much. Before I let you go, remind everyone how they can find out more about you and get access to the webinar.
Well, the best place is to go to, if you can't remember, cyberhive.tv, or if you don't spell it right, which is where the masterclass webinars are, you could just go to my name, Frank Jacob, and add .com at the end. Then at the very top of that website is a menu bar with links that will take you directly to the source of the webinars and other things as well. If you want to reach out and write me an email, there's a contact form on that page. But yeah, that's the best place to go. And maybe you'll put a link down below in the description where people can jump there as well. And yeah, I encourage people to do the webinar because I think it will save you a lot of time and it'll save you a lot of pain, because it really is meticulously put together based on really high integrity information. And it really leads us in exciting new directions. And I think, and I'm hoping it will open open up the discussions to encompass, where things are going with respect to disclosure, and adding another dynamic to it, which will lift it out of something I'm saying is like a dead end right now in the disclosure field.
Right on. And I will have those links easily accessible for everyone as they listen. Frank, thank you so much. We'll definitely have to do this again. Until next time, everyone, have an excellent evening. We'll talk again tomorrow. See y'all then.